You're listening to Distraction Therapy with Rob Watson. Conversations about how we find meaning in our lives and what it's like to be part of a meta-modern world. Hello, it's Friday the 16th of December and I'm Rob Watson and this is a Distraction Therapy podcast, and today I'm joined by Jonathan Taylor and Harry, I can't remember your surname.
Whitehead.
So I'm going to get them to introduce themselves because I think it's better that the introduction comes in detail and directly from yourselves. Harry, tell us what you do and kind of a little bit about your how you've got to where you are today.
Sure, okay. Well, I'm a novelist and an associate professor of creative writing at the University of Leicester, where I'm also director of the university's annual Free Lit Fest, Literary Leicester. I've been there for about 12 long years, and before that I worked in the film business, so I haven't been a kind of lifelong academic, but I've come from a very different place.
I'm teach creative writing at Leicester University as well. I'm a writer. I've written novels, a memoir and poetry, and unlike Harry, I have been in the university system almost all my life. So I've worked in all of the different Leicestershire universities and other universities as well, teaching creative writing.
Cool. One of the challenges, I think, so you've been around Leicester for a while, is thinking about, if you like, the culture of the how would you describe it? If you jump in with any, you kind of, I'm fishing for a term here because I've not thought it through properly, and the coffee hasn't kicked in yet. Oh, by the way, we're in Leicester Coffee House on Granby Street, who are hosting us today. But the idea of a kind of, when I first came to Leicester, I think there was about 3 or 4 bookshops 30 years ago. Now there's a small basement for Waterstones in the shopping centre, and I had a look at those. I went to the philosophy department the other week. One shelf with about 6 books on it or something like that. So what's your immediate kind of a literary festival for Leicester that's been run? Describe that to us, and what you think the kind of impact it has or might need to have in the future?
Okay, well, I'm going to start by talking about bookshops because it's a bee that remains in my bonnet. I was an assistant manager in an independent bookshop in the late 90s when the net book agreement was killed off, essentially by Waterstones. So it's an irony now, and around 80% of independent bookshops in the country closed down within the next few years. So it's quite an irony that we're sort of clinging on to Waterstones as our city bookshop. I'm very happy to see Fox Books open recently in the centre of Leicester, another independent bookshop. So anyway, I've got that out of the way. Literary Leicester's been going since about 2008, and I took over directing it sort of 7 or 8 years ago, I guess. The first thing we've always been about is being free in a plural city. So that gives us the opportunity to get a wider audience in than perhaps we might normally get. But what I have learned is how tricky it is to reach beyond the usual suspects. So it's great, we get a lot of kind of the older white population of Leicester who attend the festival, but trying to reach beyond that has been quite a lot harder, and it's something that most literary festivals recognise. I think it's around 3 or 4% is the average kind of minority group's attendance at festivals. So for us it's been how do we reach out, how do we get people to attend a literary festival on a university campus where they might feel self-conscious about it, they might not want to go to a university and so on. So we've been trying to sort of place what we call stepping stones to the festival by having smaller events throughout the year, by trying to put some of the events around the city and outside of the university, because universities and literary festivals are kind of considered to be white events, or traditionally at least have. And that, as a middle-aged white man, I've had to learn quite a lot really about what to do, what to schedule, what to think about when we're advertising the festival, and so on. And I think first and foremost it's about being more interesting in the events we host. So not simply big name authors, but conversations, topical conversations that people think, oh, that's interesting, and people they might have heard of as well, from beyond the normal kind of white bookshop land.
Well, I just want to add to what Harry's just said, that I think Harry and the team at Literary Leicester have been incredibly successful at doing that, actually, compared to other festivals in the country, at reaching beyond the normal demographic for the festival. But I mean, my experience is inevitably overlapping, but also slightly different. And I've really noticed in Leicester over the years that Leicester has a really democratic literary scene, I think, and obviously Literary Leicester is part of that as well. But all over that, there are lots of open mic series that sometimes last for a few years and then disappear, but other ones appear, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of writers in the city and in the county for that matter, who support each other. There's opportunities, it seems to me, in Leicestershire for everyone from beginners to more experienced writers, and so I think there is a really positive environment for writers in Leicester and Leicestershire. Obviously, there are problems in terms of access, in terms of poverty, and so on and so forth. But certainly, I think not just universities, but the city itself and the community. There are all sorts of things going on, at least on a small level. I think Leicester doesn't have the kind of really big networks that, for example, Nottingham has as a city of literature, UNESCO City of Literature, but it does have lots of a smaller network, if you see what I mean, a more democratic one of lots of things going on.
Doesn't have the myth, does it? We've got. I mean, Nottingham have got. What's the name of the famous poet? It's gone off the top of my head.
Lawrence,
yeah.
Yeah.
But and Leicester's got Orton and Sue Townsend.
Yeah.
But it's how do you? It's kind of almost how you shape those kind of things.
And I always think that a city's literary culture is partly determined by the kind of forebears that are there. So Nottingham's literary culture very much kind of Alan Sillitoe, D.H. Lawrence. Leicester's much more kind of eccentric, Joe Orton, as you say, Sue Townsend. Again, very democratic, left-leaning, liberal, and sort of egalitarian in that way.
Also, I think Leicester's had to deal with never being a destination city, never being the kind of place that people come to other than for work. So it hasn't had a sort of self-consciousness about itself. I mean, that's the strength in that it's an easygoing place. And I came to Leicester from London 12 years ago, dead snotty about the whole journey, and have been completely changed.
There's one thing I learned. If you turn up in Leicester and say, we're going to give you a London-style experience, whether it's a club or a hair salon, it's like, that doesn't go down well at all. It's like nobody's interested. And that translation is remarkable, isn't it? An hour away on the train, but it does feel a very kind of different kind of culture. And it was who are the kind of names that pull people in, that get people interested, that get your students? Who if you were having your dream literary festival, who would you want to bring in that you think really would kind of hit the buttons for people?
Wow, I wish I'd prepped that one, because that would take some thought in terms of my personal dream festival. Probably wouldn't be so reflective of my ideal festival for the general population. But students are tricky customers to get into to literary events. Often the people they know are kind of very well-known young adult writers, or the Margaret Atwoods and Neil Gaimans, and the people who are a little bit too galactic and expensive to draw to the festival. But the really big and exciting events we've had have often been discussions, but have involved kind of iconic writers, like with Linton Kwesi Johnson in conversation with Carol Phillips was probably one of the great events I think we ever had, because they sparked off each other. They drew in a much different crowd than the normal crowd. There were 250, 300 people there. So that, conversation events. I don't know. Dream authors, dream events.
I think one of the difficulties is, especially with literature, but this might apply to other arts as well, is that fame or celebrity or whatever is relative to the observer. So there are plenty of people in the world for whom, I don't know, Madonna. They don't know who that is, she's no one to my mum, whereas to a lot of people she would be incredibly famous. But this is especially the case, I think, in literature, where the literary world, I think, is incredibly exciting, but it's also kind of lots of different camps, lots of different groups. And so, even with me and Harry, the writers that I really, really look up to would be different to the ones that you do, and that would be the case for everyone. And there've been people who have, even now, there are people who I suddenly realise are really lauded as writers. And I think, oh no, not heard of them.
Well, isn't that amazing? I mean, there's so much. You read an obituary for somebody, and it's like, I've never heard of them. Yes. I'll give you a story. This is my one and only literary story. Years ago, when I was a postgrad student, and I was invited to go to the graduation ceremony at the university and carry the stick and things like that. And I said, I'll only do it if I come to the lunch. So I went to the lunch and was sitting there with a snotty-nosed kid from, kind of sitting there at this dinner. And the guy I was sat next to was J.G. Ballard. And I'd never heard of him. He was amazing. He was absolutely amazing. Just gave off this aura. And these professors were sitting around the table. His wife was with them. And he was like just this... So, of course, the next thing I go out and do is buy as many of his books as I possibly could, and just a lifelong fan ever since. But it's that the process of engagement is kind of important, and I find that maybe there's a class element to this. Kind of there's an assumption that you're in publishing circles. London publishing circles, you go to cocktail parties and launches and things like that, and everybody assumes that Hampstead, everybody assumes that everybody else is in that kind of world, but it's like the culture outside of that. What's the process because you were describing the best, you change the process of engagement to have the conversation rather than it being a traditional talk. What was different about that?
Sure. Well, it started, I went to the London Book Fair, to this conference about running literary festivals, and the person who runs Latitude said the biggest literary event they ever had, and I was thinking Kazuo Ishiguro or some Nobel Prize winner, whatever. It was called Shackleton. And it was someone who'd written a biography of Shackleton, and thousands of people came, because it's the kind of thing everyone's heard of Shackleton, but no one quite really knows the story. That kind of thing. So,
and it was a book fair. I've been to Latitude years ago, and it's the Radio 4 tent, and it's
huge.
The book tent in the music festival.
That's
it isn't
right.
separate from that.
That's right. But that was their biggest ever event. So that really stuck with me, and what I know is that I have to market the festival, and one has to have 2 or 3 names that you throw out and say, wow, this Booker Prize winner's coming, or that, or whatever. But what happens is, at the last festival we had, for instance, some of the biggest events we had were events without any big-name authors, but with some of our academics. There was one called 10 Books That Changed the World, where 10 academics pitched a great book, and then everyone's going to vote for it. That was a sellout. 100 Years of Fascism was another one that had over 100 people in the middle of the day, in the middle of the week. So people are really interested, and often I think they're interested in what's going on up there on the hill in that campus, and they want to they want to access it. You just got to kind of, make it not seem imposing and give people access. So I'm a big fan of the great writers and the great literature and the big subjects and so on. I'm not necessarily stepping away from that, but I want to find a way for everybody to come and enjoy that without imagining that somehow it's part of some higher culture that they can't access or won't understand or will feel self-conscious about.
I think it ties in with something, in a kind of loose sense, that ties in with something that I've really noticed. That obviously I know lots of avid readers who have nothing to do with universities or to do with creative writing and aren't writers themselves. And so many readers that you meet, despite what the publishing houses think in London, read a book and remember what the book was about, and sometimes remember the title, but they don't remember the name of the author. So they'll say, "Oh, I read this great book. It was about it was about a guy who's visited by the ghost of his father, who tells him he has to kill the new king, who's his brother." And but I can't remember, it's Hamlet or something. And they don't remember the name of the author, and so it is kind of one of my bugbears. That
it's the marketing myth, isn't it? That you remember the brand, and actually you don't. You remember the story.
And one of the things, one of my bugbears, and funnily enough, it's especially the case in the world of poetry, which is where you get magazines that on the cover has got the photographs of the main stars within, and that is just talking to the people who know who they are, Whereas actually, what a lot of people, especially for poetry, they love a poem, but they don't go away and read the whole of Rudyard Kipling because they know and I think that is really important that to acknowledge. So it's marketing. It's trying to turn it into a kind of celebrity culture, which
it's
which
also,
is alien.
But it's also a byproduct of the era we're in, where identity is all, age of narcissism or whatever you call it. But I agree. I don't really give a damn about the author's biography and the author's life. Even now, even though I'm right in the middle of all this, I find that rather puts me off. It was a slightly dodgy choice of author, but I love the work of V.S. Naipaul, but he was a hideous bastard in his life, But he shrugged it off when he was writing his work, and so I revere his work.
I'm at the moment I'm a massive fan of Wagner, but what a horrible person he turned out to be.
Absolutely.
It's like, what do you do?
Absolutely.
Is there a class? There's always a class element to this, but popularisation doesn't address issues about class expectation, if you like. And I just wonder whether it's like literary culture is very middle class. Has all the accoutrements and the routines of wordplay, extended Latin. It can go down the rabbit hole. Is there something wrong with having that popular side of things? How do we keep the two linked together and part of the same culture rather than viewed as two separate kind of cultures?
I kind of disagree. I don't think. I don't think. ideally literary culture is elitist. Obviously, it's all things are kind of, especially in this country, infected by the class system and recouped by capitalism and so on and so forth. But I think literary culture at its best is one of the most democratic arts, and I think Leicester is an example of that, because, and this is something that I tell my students all the time, that I believe that unlike maybe music at its highest level, that writing is entirely learned. There is nothing natural about writing, and that therefore anyone can learn it, and it is democratic. I mean, yes, you have to be very persistent sometimes, but in that way, it is a much more open field than certain kinds of arts. Although I think there's something to be said about that as well. But yeah,
you see, I am actually an elitist, but not in the way that elitism is normally applied. I just think that you should determine there is a hierarchy, because people put different amounts of effort and thought into things, and it's kind of almost it's the how much does somebody give a damn about what they're doing and what they're trying to figure out. And I think that's a better value kind of hierarchy to have, rather than it almost, if you like, you went to this certain kind of schools and you went to a certain kind of university and you learned to write about, we've had prime ministers who learned, a scant knowledge of Roman history, and they lord it over us for generations that they somehow are superior. but it doesn't determine the value of something. That cultural value notion is a process, is it? Is that how you see it? Is it something which isn't fixed, changes, is impacted by lots of other things?
Well, in part it's about a predisposition towards a certain type of literature, isn't it? And that's, I think, what one has to overcome. I think when I'm talking about the literary festival, often we have this conversation about the middle class audience, the white-haired audience, la la la, and great, I say, bring them in, but give access to everyone to that literature that's perhaps traditionally been seen as middle class educated literature. It's not kind of. It's not, get some celebrity author who's written some half-baked piece of rubbish to join the festival. Tempting though that really is, to lift the festival's kind of this will pull in the crowds, and also all the media will suddenly become interested, and we'll get thousands more people. But then I've hummed and hawed about whether I'm just being an elitist thinking that, It's not something that has an easy resolution. That's why I think it's about a predisposition towards different literatures.
And that sort of ties in with something that I've always been interested in, which is that my father's generation, they grew up in sort of abject poverty in the 1920s and early 30s in Oldham, and they were as poor, poor as it's possible to be, really. In the end, my father was sold to another family, and yet they used to ring me up when I was sort of in my teens and talk to me about which Tchaikovsky symphony that I liked the best, and then one of my aunties claimed to have read the whole works of Dickens long before I was, because I did my PhD on Dickens, and she was talking to me about that. And so I think that it's always a danger, I think, to assume that a certain kind of that this is exclusive. This, as you say, that this interest is exclusive to a particular class.
I mean, there's nothing wrong when you change the language and, so you say, established and non-established audiences, or networks or communities of readers, or listeners, or wherever it is. It's kind of changes the dynamic slightly, and there's the taste is not a problem, and it's the assumption that people make that because you come from a working class background, a very similar kind of, not the poverty element of it, but a similar experience in terms of, I remember, it's kind of just the fact that you sit and read books sometimes. If you come from a working class background, it's like kind of, it excludes you. And the most depressing film I've ever seen in my life is Jude the Obscure, the one with Christopher Eccleston in, and it's like, oh my God, it's such a grim picture of kind of somebody who wants to shift class, because we in this country necessitate class, education, literariness with social class, that we kind of think, well, we can't go into a bookshop. It's not the kind of place for us.
Well, I think, universities have been as guilty of that, and English literature's been as guilty of that as anyone, haven't they? Canonising literature through the 20th century. I remember there was I can't remember the exact details of it, somebody talking about being in Ireland in the 1950s, I think it was, and getting off a bus. They were on a music tour, a band going around Ireland, and they were getting off a bus somewhere, and the bus driver leaned out and quoted from Ulysses at length to them, something relevant to how they were dressed. I loved that story. I thought, yeah, well, where's that gone?
Yeah, that kind of integration in life. I'm going to ask you a question, and I'll tell you mine first because I always like telling it. But one of my inspirational plays and movies is where I primarily sit. So it was Educate and Retail, and just a fantastic Willie Russell's that dynamic of working class transformation. Was just great for me. It really kind of felt right. This is something I can identify with. What inspired you?
Go on, you go first.
I mean, there are obviously like all sorts of different, and that's a way of stalling while I think of an answer to the question. But there are obviously also all sorts of different things. I mean, actually, going back to what we were just talking about, that I think one of my theories about Britain in general in terms of the arts is that actually almost all, and this is a massive generalisation, but almost all of the best writers and musicians and probably artists as well, although I know less about that, but certainly musicians and writers in Britain have been in some way on the margins, and that the kind of the sort of mainstream upper class or ruling class artists. Well, I'm thinking even you go back to Wordsworth et al. They were provincial. He grew up in the Lake District. Elgar who's seen as like the most act English artist of all, was actually provincial, lower middle class, and Catholic, and he actually tried to move to the centre and become part of the mainstream in London, and it was hell for him, and he ended up moving back to Worcester. So I do believe that actually that in some ways that to be an artist is not to be mainstream, which is not to say that there aren't other kinds of privilege at work, but
to make a living out of it, you
well,
kind of do that,
yeah,
dance with it.
And musicians in Britain have a really tough time. It's not a democratic sort of level playing field at all.
So you dodged answering the question about who inspires you.
Well, go to Harry first,
because he's had time to think about it.
And then I'll come back to me.
Who or what? You said what?
Well, whichever. What was what has inspired you? What was that touchstone that you kind of go? Actually, you know what? That put me on a pathway.
I think Jonathan's point was really well made, and I was just thinking about that in terms of my own experience. And when I was in primary school, I think I was probably 9, we had a writing competition where we had to write a story about the Nativity. And everyone else wrote about Jesus, about babies, all this. I wrote about a pissed off mouse who lived in the barn and was really annoyed by the imposition of all these people, and I won by a landslide, and from that moment I was a writer. But my mother ran a children's home that I lived in and grew up in, which was obviously a marginalising, complex experience, and that was a really accurate reflection of that. I don't think I've ever consciously thought that thought before I was listening to Jonathan say that now. So yeah, I think a degree of marginalisation is very good for a creative in that it gives you what's visceral. It gives you something that you can sort of grip onto, that you feel the need to nibble at and nag
you
at.
crave acceptance, but you actually in reality can't have it because it corrupts the what motivates you to actually act creatively. And
yeah, I think you have to have a degree of personal capability, a personal kind of ability to function is what I'm trying to say. You can't be too broken or too marginalised, because that doesn't help art. But I think it has to be a kind of balance of the two.
Yeah, it's funny you should mention nativities. I was saying to someone the other day that the only part I've ever had in a nativity was I was 10 and they cast me as a drunk vicar. I don't remember there being a drunk vicar in the Gospels. But yes, for some reason I was a drunk vicar.
Set on your path, don't you?
Yes. That from there to academic is a short step. But no, in terms of, I was thinking about the question about who inspired you, and actually going back to what we were saying about marginalisation, but also provincial. I think a lot of the best writers in Britain have been provincial, have not been. Even Dickens is a kind of provincial writer. He grew up in the provinces, even though he's become the kind of sign of London. And I was thinking the person who really kind of changed my way of looking at writing was a provincial writer of the late 19th, early 20th century called Arnold Bennett. So I grew up in Stoke-on-Trent, and he was at that time the author. Just as we've said, that each city has its kind of ancestors, literary ancestors. For Stoke-on-Trent, they had Arnold Bennett. And all I knew about him when I was growing up was a local saying, which was that no one ever comes to Stoke, no one ever leaves Stoke, apart from Arnold Bennett, and even he had to write about it. And no one had read it. And so one day when I was sort of 16, I sat down and read one of his novels, Clayhanger, and it absolutely changed my life for two reasons. Firstly, because up to then I'd been obsessed with fantasy, and all I read was science fiction and fantasy really as a teenager, and I just assumed I wanted to be a writer, but I assumed that being a writer was writing about the absolute other to your life. Who on earth would ever want to write about Stoke-on-Trent or my family life? And suddenly I'm reading this book, which was about having, Clayhanger has a sick father who has a mental illness, which, a neurological illness, which my father had. And suddenly I'm reading it and thinking, God, actually, books can also move you and change you by being, by partly reflecting your life as well. And that maybe you can write about the place where you are. Maybe your own experience does matter. And of course, now I'm older, what I realise, of course, is that Tolkien et al., they're really writing about their homes and their places anyway, in a displaced sense. It's just a bit more distanced. But it was that sort of revelation that actually, oh God, literature actually can also not just be different, but also be this. If a dog doesn't appreciate Arnold Bennett, a critic, that experience of suddenly realising that literature can be both different and the same was revelatory to me, I think. And I remember reading it in the sixth form common room, the sixth form college common room, and just bursting into tears in front of everyone.
I think my crossover was first from fantasy and sci-fi, because same thing, was Alan Garner first, who was kind of both an incredible writer, and I just was obsessed with everything. I still am in some ways. I still read some of his books regularly, and then I don't know whether it was a reflection of the time, but Hermann Hesse. I became bizarrely obsessed with Hermann Hesse about age 16. I read Siddhartha first, and then through my teenagers, and I look back at those books and I think, how on earth was I equating myself, and maybe with Siddhartha and the kind of idea of sort of freedom and things like this, personal freedom, but the others, I read all the others, and I look back now and I think the Glass Bead Game, what had that to do with me at all? But I was just obsessed with it.
Yeah, that kind of age, it was Keith Waterhouse and Billy Lyer. And I remember buying Woodbine cigarettes, and my brother, I was 16 at the time, and my brother snatched them, threw them away for me because I was trying to smoke some Woodbines because I thought it was cool. You know, it's that, you're living out that fantasy of that kind of, the evocation of it becomes something that you kind of embody and live in a way.
And I think that's what the best novels are dreams, aren't they? And or story that they're dreams. So they're kind of they're both fantasies. They're both displaced versions of yourself, but also you recognise yourself in them, and that they work on both levels. So there is that kind of, like a dream, there is that kind of escapist element, but there's also that kind of very deep identification.
It's interesting you say that, because I find almost no writer writes dreams well.
Well, that's true.
It's as if, but I agree with the sentiment that most fictional stories are kind of dreams. But maybe I was just thinking maybe that's why dreams within dreams become a little like artifices. I so often skip through the sort of obligation so many writers feel to write a dream sequence in the middle of their novel. But there are so few, I don't know if you can name any, who write great dreams.
I can actually.
Go on.
I was just thinking when you were talking,
Yeah.
a couple of years ago I read, it's called A Book of Dreams, and it's William Burroughs, the American writer, William Burroughs' last memoir novel. No one's quite sure what it is. And it's absolutely insane. But it is kind of part memoir, part just a kind of record of his dreams. And I think you have to read it without any expectation of story. But in terms of images, there's some beautiful, amazing, kind of weird things in it.
I think it's also the model of dreams. So if you follow kind of, I think Freud corrupted the notion of dreams, and kind of it became, you see it in Hitchcock and things like that, where it became this kind of the subconscious and all of these kind of representations of sexuality and stuff like that, and that scared people away from actually. If you get there are different models of dreams, Jungian models of it, of active imagination and things like that, where you look at it on a more symbolic point. It's an expression of the unconscious, and writing as a process. You guys are talking with people constantly, and you're introducing people to the idea that there's a process to the writing of it's got to come from somewhere, hasn't it? And that pulling this vague, it's like pulling air, into something which becomes a narrative on a page. How do you guide people through that process?
Well, there's a kind of taboo in creative writing teaching about that, the initial pulling of the idea about the subject matter, if you like, and we tend to steer them through the crafting of the material that is innately theirs. I've been doing some research into Soviet-era creative writing because it grew up at the same time as it did in the US. And their take, perhaps unsurprisingly, was precisely the opposite, that you began with a discussion of, who you are as an individual and why did you come up with that idea, and does it make sense translating from you as an individual to the universal. And so there was very little discussion of the kind of craft elements that we teach. It was all focused on the former. So I've been kind of getting a little bit Soviet on my students, at least at the beginning of a couple of my modules, by talking about what are the big subjects, what are your subjects, what's important to you as people of your generation, but also you as individuals. And then we have a little kind of questioning session about that. And actually, it's been working. I think I'm getting better material through. The first couple of weeks, you often kind of don't get submissions from the students who are due to submit because they've become self-conscious about what they've been writing. But after that, it gets quite interesting. So I do wonder about the sort of hallowed nature of that sort of creative space that one goes to alone, finds the jewel and brings it back, or whether it's the whole thing is craft actually.
I think it's that debate, isn't it, about that was Soviet era, which is the debate between formalism versus anti-formalism, and there is certainly sometimes, I agree with you. I think sometimes that there is sometimes an overemphasis on the kind of formalist aspect of writing, whereas actually there is. I mean, I teach a lot of memoir, and that's kind of my first creative book was a memoir, and it's sort of one of my main interests. And obviously with memoir, you are sort of starting with what is your raw material, what is in front of your nose. And obviously you get students like I was as a teenager who want to write about goblins and mountains and rings and so on and so forth. But the power of starting with memoir is that you're saying, yeah, but what is in front of your nose? What have you missed? And what is the imperative? I mean, I think that for any, and I don't want to sound mystical here, but any art that doesn't have some kind of imperative behind it, even if that imperative is hidden to the artist, is not going to be any good. As in, like, I got to do this. I've got to do this. Yeah, a drive, or this has got, not even I've got to do this. This has got to be done. And without that, I think, even on a small scale, that it just becomes kind of hot air. But that's not to say that the imperative has to be a huge one. It's not kind of necessarily kind of, oh, I've got to save the world from climate change. It might be something kind of, a small impact. But there has to be, when you write poetry, often the imperative's quite a small one, but it has to be there. Sometimes you don't know what it is till after. And that's especially the case in my experience with fiction, that if you write fiction, it's not until after you think, oh God, I realised why I wrote that, because I was blah 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 blah.
I mean, there's maybe there's always two kinds of things, isn't there? But there's maybe a kind of level of writing which is about confirming what you know, and then there's a level of writing which is about not understanding why you're writing something, but you're compelled to go on that kind of journey to discover in the process of writing. So historical writing, kind of historical biographies are kind of, you list things and that has its value. But then there's the other kind of more open, where you don't know, what how the narrative would unfold and what its themes would be. And
yeah, absolutely. I think with the majority of creative writing, you have you're a bit like a nomad in the desert, and there are the oases you're going to hit. but you know, it may be a 3-day walk, and what's going to happen during that walk, what you're going to come across, trying to get to the next plot point or the next imperative or whatever, is what often makes the art. It's the emergent quality that makes it more than the sum of its parts. It's the journeying. I remember I'd read this great essay by a social scientist, actually, called Laurel Richardson, called, about how writing is thinking. And she said she'd never written an academic essay that ended up where she thought it was going to end up after she set off on the journey of writing. And that, you know, that's an academic essay. So I really buy into that there's because it takes a certain amount of time. It's your consciousness is in time, and so it's moving and developing as it's doing the actual physical function of the writing. So
do you do that thing when you look back at what you've written, you go, who wrote that?
Often,
yeah. It's like, did I write this? It's like, it looks like, you know, when I've done stuff. I mean,
well, it's like trying to edit a short story or edit a novel 4 or 5 years later. You just think, I don't know where to start. I don't know, because I'm completely different. I'm in a totally different space. Someone said that all male novelists' first novel are acts of patricide, which really made me laugh. And I thought, oh yeah, that's a great line to kind of chuck out there, ha ha. And I look back at The Cannibal Spirit, my first book, you know, years afterwards, and it's exactly what it was. But I had no idea, obviously, at all, that I was having a dig at my father's beliefs, which was at least, and actually quite a major chunk of what the book was kind of trying to journey through and at least understand.
Before Harry goes off and gets his Christmas shopping, because we've got a few minutes before that happens, is where do you get your media information? What newspapers, magazines, radio programs, TV programs, websites, wherever? Where do you plug in to your culture around?
Private eye. I listen to the radio. Well, I listen to Radio 3, so when the news comes up, I may listen to that. I trawl for information. I've got an Open Democracy and climate, you know, a few climate websites, Tortoise, and a few of those kind of news sites where I tend to look for news. And then I gaze in horror at the BBC website a few times a day, and at their, you know, inexorable move to the right.
Yeah, I mean, if we talk about news, then I watch BBC News, I watch Channel 4 News, ITV News, or at least I do sometimes. There have been times in the last 2 or 3 years when I've looked away on purpose, which I don't think I'm alone in that.
But you're not getting your cultural nourishment through this, are you?
No, and I think in terms of stuff about literature, I mean, you know, obviously the Guardian website, and also just social media. You know, but actually, the writing community is a big one on Twitter and so on and so forth. So
do you still like hanging out in libraries, bookshops, and, you know?
I used to, but I have no time to do anything. You know, I've got 2 young children.
You don't
in this
escape
job.
for it. I've got 2 hours. I'm going to go to Foyles and just wander the floors.
Yeah, my first job was at Foyles. I used to pack boxes of books when I was 16 in the basement with Edna and Mavis and me, and send boxes of books off all over the world for 68 quid a week. Oh, it was just one of the happiest jobs I ever had.
that's funny, because my first job was in what was then called students' bookshops, and at first the first few months I just worked in the accounts department, so it was the kind of paperwork of books, but yeah, I did also work in various bookshops, and yeah, it was lovely, actually. It was really, really lovely.
That's where your literary understanding was framed around the price of everything and the value of nothing. It's like the wholesale price in particular.
Books, at that point, books were just invoices.
Yeah. This one sells well.
Depressing, isn't it?
Yeah.
But No, I think that kind of, I think COVID particularly it's only recently that any kind of face-to-face community in terms of writing, only in the last sort of year or so that it's kind of started to revive. And so I think that is important. But at the same time, there's been an explosion of online events in lots of different contexts. And so that has its advantages and disadvantages. And one of the advantages is that you can now go attend a book. You know, I was attending a book launch the other month in Canada, even though, you know, we never get out of Leicestershire. It was lovely to be able to see that. So there's advantages and disadvantages. I mean, the disadvantages are you don't have those kind of after event chats.
Yeah, the serendipitous moments where you find they've got a little bookshop that, you know, there's a basement there with some bargains in and you can't help yourself, but, you know, or a conversation with somebody.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Listen, I've got to duck out because I'm meeting my wife in 5 minutes.
Okay, just last question then. Where can people find out more about you? Have you got a profile site?
I don't have my own personal website. Jonathan's much more organised than me about that. But Google me and the pesky university website will describe almost all, I guess.
Jonathan, what about yourself?
The same. I'm on the Leicester University website, but I've also got a website which is just jonathanptaylor.co.uk, and you Google me, and I'm also on Twitter at CrystalClearJT.
We'll do that again soon, I think.
Yeah, that was great. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. That's brilliant.
You've been listening to Distraction Therapy with me, Rob Watson. Find out more at robwatsonmedia.net or follow me on Instagram and Twitter at RobWMedia.